Welcome back. KXEL Live and Local continuing in this, the 8 o'clock hour on a Tuesday, 7th day of November for 2023. Good to have you along. We have made the connection via Zoom with Michael Swanger. Mr. Swanger is the publisher and owner of Iowa History Journal. The fine publication comes out 6 times a year. The November-December issue just released. Mr. Swanger, good morning, and thank you much for the time.
Good morning, Jeff. Well, miracles never cease that you get the print guy to get Zoom to operate correctly.
I feel like I'm lucky when I get the print guy to actually do radio, but then we add the video component so that we can have a better conversation, and I am just living right today. Let's talk about this issue. This is the final issue of Volume 15. So that's an awful lot. If you start doing the math, I think that's 90 issues of the publication over the course of that decade and a half, and a beautiful full-color portrait on the cover. Tell us about the cover story this time, please.
Well, it's a portrait of James Harlan, and those who know even just a modicum of Iowa's history should know that name because he's one of the most influential political leaders that our state has ever produced. And, of course, like so many of those early leaders in politics in Iowa, he wasn't born here, but he lived the rest of his life here. And the Harlan name is ubiquitous, certainly in eastern Iowa and across the state. And he's one of those figures that has been written about in other stories where he's so connected to, from Abraham Lincoln to Iowa Wesleyan College, et cetera. But we had not given him what I felt was necessary, which was a full, proper cover story. So here we are, and I thought it was a good time of year to do it because his name has been in the news this year as well. So it was a good time to do it.
Remind us of why his name was in the news this year in particular.
Well, there was a couple of things. One was the unfortunate closing of Iowa Wesleyan College earlier this year, where his statue has been situated for the last 9 years, because as some folks may recall, the statue, after spending 104 years in the U.S. Capitol Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C., was relocated to Mount Pleasant in 2014 and was on the campus there. So he was a longtime connection to that college because he was one of the first president. And of course, a lot of people know about the Harlan Lincoln House, and of course the Harlan Lincoln Hotel, and the connection there because the president's house, which was named after him, was on the campus. And there's a lot of history just in those buildings alone. We could probably fill this segment just talking about the historic architecture there.
And that is the interesting thing, as you mentioned, the genesis of the article. I imagine after a while you'd read stories that would come through and the Harlan name pops up here, and then a few months later it might pop up there, and at some point you say, he's showing up a lot in the magazine, and it's time for him to get his due. Let's talk about the Harlan-Lincoln connection, if you will, so that helps orient us in terms of when Mr. Harlan was at his peak in terms of political power.
Well, especially during the end there of the Civil War. And just to back up for a moment, for those of listeners who may not know, he was a leader in the early 19th century. He was one of the founders of the Iowa Republican Party. He was a staunch anti-slavery advocate. He was twice elected senator in Iowa, and he was a significant figure not only in Iowa but on the national stage. But I think a lot of folks do remember that relationship that he had with Lincoln, because he was appointed by Lincoln as Secretary of the Interior at the end of the Civil War, and making Harlan the first Iowan to serve on a federal cabinet. But what's more, there was a great close family connection, as you know, Jeff, because of their children. And of course, a lot of folks may remember that Harlan's daughter, Mary Harlan, married Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln. And they lived in what is known as the Harlan Lincoln House, which is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is also a museum. So there's that connection. They were very close. I think you and I have even talked about this before when we wrote about Lincoln, that during the Civil War, and of course their connections not only through the Republican Party, but because of the family connections later on, although I want to add that the kids weren't married until 1868, 3 years after Lincoln's death. But the connection being that he was even there the night that Lincoln was assassinated, and a lot of folks may not realize that he was across the street bedside with Lincoln's unfortunately dying body when that happened. And he helped carry him out of there. So there's a long storied history between those two men.
Michael Swanger is the publisher and owner of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. We're talking about the cover story in the November-December issue, cover portrait of Senator James Harlan of Iowa. And as you were talking, obviously there was the political connection, and as you said, for Harlan to become Secretary of the Interior. We often think of members of the cabinet, the presidential cabinet, who come from Iowa, taking on roles in the ag department. And obviously right. Between Tama Jim Wilson and the Wallace family being in government, obviously Secretary Vilsack now, Interior was a very different position. And at that time, I assume it was especially of interest because of the settlement of this nation westward, settlement by Europeans westward.
Not only that, with the railroad, as you were talking about, and the settlement, but even just the fact that Lincoln trusted him the way he did, because they held different stances based on their philosophy of how the South should be treated after the end of the Civil War. And, he was, you could say that Harlan was much more extreme, kind of more on the radical end of the Republican Party at that time. He really wanted the South to pay for what it had done. And did not want to make it easy for them to come back, but of course wanted them to come back. So it was interesting that Lincoln trusted him, considering Lincoln's moderate stance and all that. And of course, to unify everyone, knowing how hardline he was, that was just one thing. And of course, when he was a senator, he helped pass all this important legislation that has still affected the nation as we know, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, as you mentioned. So we're still living in Harlan's world in many ways.
Senator James Harlan graces the cover of the current issue of Iowa History Journal. So he was in the Senate and then became a member of the presidential cabinet actually after Lincoln's assassination, correct? That's an interesting tidbit that I had not noted until I read Jerry Harrington's excellent story.
Right. And what's amazing, too, is to think that, as you know, at the time, Lincoln had a Democrat for vice president. And he had to pass approval from that person as well. The name at the moment is escaping me; it's on the tip of my tongue. But that kind of goes to show the how well respected he was across the board. That he was trusted to continue that work. And really, as the more you look into his legacy and his work with the Interior, is how much he did carry Lincoln's message forward. And what he did, and he was obviously so instrumental in helping found the Iowa Republican Party. Just incredible. I mean, he's one of the building blocks of it.
And as you note, then being president of the university, then a college at its end, University in Mount Pleasant. I mean, that's quite a wide resume. And to your point about Lincoln perhaps being more moderate, when Lincoln ran for re-election, they went with the quote unity ticket by putting a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, as the running mate. Because, again, the idea was unity as opposed to retribution against the South. And as you note, Harlan had a very different view of that. Jerry Harrington has really distinguished himself. Not only was he such a great public relations professional for many years in the ag industry, but he's written multiple books and pens a number of articles for Iowa History Journal as well.
Well, like you, Jeff, he's one of the longtime contributing writers to the magazine, who I'm grateful to for their contributions, because they're writers like yourself, and especially those who are published authors like yourself. You and Jerry both really stand out in that way, as does Don Doxey, as did the late John Skipper. You guys are, it's more than just your basic research. You guys have spent so many years delving into certain issues and topics that have become an area of expertise that it's easier for me to make these assignments, or I should say to ask that you would graciously, that the writers will write them for us, because that is kind of his forte, like yours, is politics. Jerry has a keen interest in that. And as you know, he's just come out with a new book on former Governor Harold Hughes, which is someone he's written about for us in the past. And I think he's going to do something for us in the upcoming year to kind of tie in with the release of his new book. So yeah, I'm grateful to Jerry for his expertise. He's one of those people who was fortunate enough to retire at an early age, and instead of golfing and traveling and boating and fishing and things like that, what does he do? He likes to go into archives at universities and the State Historical Society and other places. He likes to just keep digging and spend time writing and reading. So I admire that about him.
Well, and what's also interesting about Jerry, as you said, the new book is about Harold Hughes. Well, the article for Iowa History Journal takes place a century before that. And similarly, in terms of breadth, you mentioned Don Doxey, so let's transition to Mr. Doxey is well known as a sports writer, but he has the second in a two-part series of articles on World War II POWs who lived in Iowa, which again could not be further removed from his normal beat, but I guess that's probably what was of interest to him when he brought you this story.
Yeah, he especially has an interest in Civil War history. And when I asked him, "Hey, Don, what do you know about the World War II POW camps in Algona?" And I'm not saying this to tout myself here, but he said, "I didn't know about that." I said, "Well, I don't think a lot of people do," but he had such an interest in military history. He said, "Oh, I'm on that." And he did a wonderful job. So as you and I discussed a couple of months ago, the first part of his series was the cover of our September-October issue, focused on Camp Algona, which was primarily occupied by POWs from Germany and Italy. Now, the second part of his series focused on Camp Clarinda. There was two major camps in Iowa, Algona, Clarinda, and there were a number of smaller satellite camps across the state as well. Clarinda, however, was a little different. Clarinda started with by housing German POWs, and then in 1944, and then transitioned to housing primarily Japanese POWs. So Don's second part of the series is about that. What's interesting to me, Jeff, and what I didn't know until Don wrote the story, and I learned so much about Camp Clarinda through him, was that while there were about 370,000 German and 53,000 Italian soldiers that were incarcerated in U.S. POW camps across the nation during World War II, there were only about 5,400 Japanese prisoners. Well, guess where they were housed? Only in two locations, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Clarinda. And what's interesting about Don's story is that what happened behind the wire, which is why we titled it that, because when they introduced Japanese prisoners into the camp, they separated them from German prisoners, and they transferred some of those German prisoners to Algona because they did not want them mixing together. And what he uncovered was the stark differences in how those POWs were treated, how the camp treated German prisoners versus how they treated Japanese prisoners. The Japanese prisoners did not have the same kind of freedom, if you will, that the German prisoners did. There were obviously some stereotypes involved in terms of how they were perceived. And the war at that point, most notably, had shifted from Europe to Asia, because at that point, as we know, in May of 1945, Germany surrenders, and we're focusing on Japan. So he did a great job, not only of delving into all these facts, but he got some great photos. I'd never seen these photos. We actually have photos of Japanese POWs in World War II in Camp Clarinda. I think it's a great story, whether you're a history buff or not. It's just one of those things that's so fascinating that it took place on our state. To me, it's one of those must reads that we have in this issue.
Well, and that's the point about, to me anyway, over the decade and a half of the magazine, is that you may not be an aficionado of military history or of a certain time in history, but all the stories have the thread of having something very close in association with our home state. Michael Swanger of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com is the website. The November-December issue with Senator Harlan on the cover. You get it wherever you get your good magazines these days. You really ought to just flat out subscribe, iowahistoryjournal.com. But after you get the issue in the mail and you say, wow, I want to send 3 or 4 others to friends, and you decide to go to a store, where might you go?
Well, we are sold at most Hy-Vee stores, Jeff. We are also sold at every Barnes & Noble in the state. And then we are at select Mills Fleet Farm, Hartig Drug, Hy-Vee drug stores, Books A Million stores. There's a complete list on our website that I would encourage people to visit, because I do get calls and emails. Hey, You're not at my Hy-Vee. Well, we might not be at every Hy-Vee in your town, but we're at most of them. So that's a good place to reference. And I have to say this, I know here we are, we're talking only 2 weeks into the new issue. My office supply of the new issue has dwindled. I mean, it has sold much faster than I anticipated. So I really am encouraging your listeners to go pick it up on the newsstand, because I don't know how long I'll even have it in the office, to be honest with you. So please go. And there's a Waterloo Barnes and Noble, especially right there at the heart of the center of your listenership, that I would encourage people to go pick it up at.
And when you go to the website, iowahistoryjournal.com, and click on the link that says Find IHJ Near You, that's quite a spreadsheet, sir, you have on there that I'm scrolling up and down. So plenty of locations for you to find it. It is interesting these days, and you and I talked about the business of magazines previously for the Iowa Business Report. But this is the kind of industry that has really evolved and changed. And I think back to you'd wait for Time or Newsweek or U.S. News and World Report. And they suffered a little bit in the television age, but they still had the benefit of breadth. Well, now with online, et cetera, it's a very different thing. Those magazines don't have the clout that they used to. Why is it that a magazine, or how is it that a magazine of more limited interest, as opposed to, again, a broad national news weekly, how is it that you're the one that survives and thrives and grows to all these locations, as opposed to some of these national magazines that just can't get a sniff anymore from readers because news changes so quickly?
I'm glad you brought that up, Jeff. I think the short answer is that when you're a niche publication like us, you have a better chance being a smaller fish swimming in a big pond, because the big fish tend to compete for the same sources, and those are limited resources now, because everyone can go to a variety of media to get their basic news or general interest stories, things of that nature, or what's taking place on a daily matter. What we do is unique. We're the only statewide popular publication devoted exclusively to our state's history. Obviously, there is the Annals of Iowa, which is a wonderful academic publication, but it doesn't have the kind of reach that our magazine does. And you know, as you and I spoke, that when the magazine was launched in 2009 by our mutual friend Mike Chapman, it was with the goal of appealing to all Iowans. And that's what I have maintained to do in the 10 years of my ownership with it. And that's what I plan to do. I think that another thing you mentioned earlier, in terms of you don't have to be an expert of history to enjoy the magazine, is important. That's probably something I should drive home more often, frankly. I think people sometimes hear the word history and they go right back to high school, junior high. Oh, I didn't like studying history in school. But then I get a lot of calls and emails from those people who say, well, now that I've matured, I realize what I was missing and how much I enjoy it. Well, you don't have to be a quote unquote history buff, because the stories are so Iowa centric. It's about the people and the state where you live. And it's also, what we try to do is provide some context. So it's easy for you to draw some parallels between what has happened in the past and what is going on now. I know that's an obvious statement. People talk about history repeating itself. I like to think that it really rhymes more than repeats itself. But we do try to provide that context that, unfortunately, and this is not knocking them, but big daily newspapers that have suffered don't have the staff, don't have the editorial inches to devote to historical context. Now, I'm preaching to the choir saying that to you, because you're one of those media outlets that does get that. You do provide historical context in all of your work, whether you're reporting on politics or local businesses, obviously with, you know, the Iowa Almanac, totally Iowa, everything. I mean, you get it. So, and your listeners get it. So I won't beat that drum anymore. But that's one of the important keys, I think, to our success as a small business. Now, we're not Better Homes and Garden. Would we love to have that circulation? You bet. So the best thing that we can do is just continue to do good work and hope that the word of mouth advertising that we get and the generosity of folks like you who will talk to us about what we do reaches Iowans, because it's amazing to me. We're finishing our 15th year and I still get so many people who say, I didn't even know you were here. But once they find us, they're hooked, and they don't, they stick with us.
If you're worried for the holiday shopping season and Christmas about, well, I don't know how I am going to mail this fruit basket to Aunt Bessie in Peoria, there's a much better idea, and that is just send a gift subscription to Iowa History Journal. You can do that at iowahistoryjournal.com. Do they get a card in the mail, or how does someone know that I've bought a gift subscription? What do they actually get, other than me writing out a little note in the card and Aunt Bessie or whoever I named in Peoria will have it?
We did offer that for quite some time, and we recently stopped doing that only because we found out sometimes we were ruining the surprise. And I don't want to be the Grinch at Christmas, so or whatever holiday we're celebrating this time of year. There's so many. So anyway, so we don't actually send out anything. If someone calls me and wants to buy a gift subscription and requests that I send something, I'm happy to send a little handwritten note or something like that. But no. What they're going to know is that they're going to get the magazine a couple weeks ahead of time before it hits the newsstand, and that's key. And they don't have to worry about going to find it, and it's an easy gift, and it gives throughout the year. And all you have to do is go to your mailbox. It's simple.
Because it comes out 6 times a year, I don't have it calendared, and so it's always a pleasant surprise, because even though I may know that it's coming up, I know the publication schedule. We work together on this. But yet I'll come home and there it is, and it's just such a pleasant surprise. And I can tell you with the gift issue, there are times people will purchase a book or a DVD from TotallyIowa.com and will see on the little PayPal, whatever it is, invoice that comes in, I bill it to one person, but the shipping address is something wildly different. And that's usually the clue to me that this may be a gift. And so I want to make sure not to include an invoice that says how much was paid for and all. But in any case, iowahistoryjournal.com, that's where you can go for all of this. One thing I found interesting now, we've talked about this before. I attended undergraduate and law school at the University of Iowa throughout the 1980s. That was just basically what I did in the 1980s. I lived in Iowa City, which meant you had season tickets for Hawkeye football games, which meant that I got to watch Quinn Early play before he got to the NFL. And Quinn Early is in the pages of Iowa History Journal, but not because of his own athletic prowess. Tell me about that.
No. And, what great memories of watching Quinn play for the Hawkeyes is, as you know, being an alum. Yeah, Quinn contributed a wonderful story. For those who don't know, after being a star and All-American at Iowa, not only in football, but also in track, indoor and outdoor, and it was all Big Ten conference in that. Later on in his career now, he has devoted a lot of time. Well, he had devoted a lot of time into researching the story of Frank Kinney Holbrook, the Tipton native who was the Hawkeyes' first black football player. He came out about a year ago with a movie, which you can purchase for a nominal fee. The proceeds benefit the Alzheimer's Disease Association or the research towards that. And Quinn also works part-time as a Hollywood stuntman, believe it or not. But he has devoted a big chunk of his life into researching this subject of Frank Kinney Holbrook, and he was kind enough to contribute a story to us. For those who don't know, as I mentioned, Kinney was not only Iowa's first black football player, but he was a hometown hero in Tipton, Iowa, which at the time, we're talking about in 1891 when Frank Kinney had attended high school there in Tipton. He would excel academically and as a multi-sport athlete, but the family was embraced by Tipton, which was very progressive at that time regarding those things. So much so, they thought so much of him and his family that business leaders in the town got together and pooled their resources to get enough money to send him to college to represent Tipton at Iowa. And then Frank was a star for the Hawkeyes in 1895 and 1896, playing football for them. So it's a wonderful story.
And again, when we're talking about the first black football player at Iowa, this is predating, as you just noted, 1900. And that just wasn't done, because I think of, and this is something that you've written about in the past as well in the magazine, how did Floyd of Rosedale come about? Well, it's a story we'll tell on Iowa Almanac this Thursday, which is why it comes up in my mind, but it had to do with racial animosity between the Minnesota and Iowa teams. Ozzie Simmons, the great football player for Iowa, was kind of marked or targeted by Minnesota. That's what led to the governors of each state betting a pig on the outcome of the game to try to diffuse this rather nasty feud that was developing, and it's become the most iconic sports trophy of all time. But that was in the 1930s. So it's literally 4 decades after the first black player played for the University of Iowa. Well, this is the November-December issue, which means you can expect that there's a wonderful piece on Thanksgiving by our mutual friend Arvid Huseman, which I, of course, would recommend to anyone. And there is another article, and this is written by an emerita professor at the University of Northern Iowa. So I'll let you tell me a bit about that, please.
Yeah, Barbara Lounsbury, who's a retired professor there from the University of Northern Iowa. And I, full confession, I was a student of hers when I was at the University of Northern Iowa. And
does she claim that? Does she claim that?
I that's a great point. I don't know how much she wants me to share that now. That might have just blown her credibility. I was a student of hers at UNI from 90 to 92. And lo and behold, 30 some years later, she's kind enough to contribute another story for my publication. And she did a wonderful job writing about one of Iowa's lost riders. The name is Ruth Suckow. And I think a big part of why she's not remembered is because a lot of people just butcher her last name the way they pronounce it to begin with. But Barbara has devoted a lot of her time and energy, even while she was a professor, and certainly into retirement, to exploring her life story. So much so that she's also the president of the Ruth Suckow Memorial Association, which are the organizers of an exhibition that is going to host visits across the state, because Ruth, during her years growing up in Iowa, lived in 12 communities across Iowa. I mean, you could literally almost draw a line from east to west where she lived. And there's going to be several events that we listed in her story that are going to take place. So we want to get this story in now to kind of preview what's going to happen throughout the calendar year of 2024. If you understand the depth and the importance of Iowa's literary legacy and history here, then you're going to appreciate what they're doing. You're certainly going to appreciate her story.
All that and much more in the November-December 2023 issue of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. There is a link right there where you can find the dozens and dozens and dozens of stores that carry the magazine if you'd like to pick up additional copies, or if you're not familiar with it, this is a great issue to sample because, again, it's a great example of the diverse topics and authors that are found in each issue. Mr. Swanger, thank you much for the time. I appreciate it greatly, and we'll talk again when the January-February issue comes out, if not before, sir.
Looking forward to it. Thank you again, Jeff.
Michael Swanger is publisher and owner of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. Senator James Harlan, wonderful color portrait of him, graces the cover. Again, you can get it at Hy-Vee. You can get it at Barnes & Noble, so many other places, or subscribe at iowahistoryjournal.com. And he joined me via Zoom for this conversation on a Tuesday edition of KXEL Live and Local. We've got a bottom of the hour break, a little late now, but that's all right. We'll still bring you the Lou Dobbs Business Report. And on the other side, Dustin Hoffman of the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network with today's RFD 1540 conversation as we continue on News Talk 1540 KXEL, where Iowa comes to talk.